And you know what? Families, especially Christian families, should take seriously the allegation that we haven't taught our children and teens well enough when it comes to these issues. And are we being silent when we should be educating correctly? Pastor Bryce here, and welcome back to 5 Minutes for the Family. And I'm glad you decided to join us this week. And this week we're going to be tackling a topic that has been looming over our society for the last several decades, as well as a topic that has been increasing in intensity over the last several years. And the topic I'd like to talk about today is sex education as it relates to families, schools, the court system, and television. And it has become obvious in recent years that in the world in which we live today, the world is seeking to educate our children and our teens using their own agenda when it comes to sexual matters. First of all, let's take, for example, the school system. In the school system in recent years, there has been a debate going back and forth about sex education. And there are those that would like to see reform in sex education, as well as those that would like to not see sex education in school at all. And so first, let's start off with those that are against sex education in the school system. Those that are against sex education in the school system would say that they don't want the school educating their children and teens when it comes to these matters, but they believe that they as the parents should be the one to educate their children and teens on these sexual issues. And I totally agree with that statement. It is not the position of the state to educate your children and teens when it comes to these things, but it is the responsibility of families to educate when it comes to these issues. And those that are for sex education in the schools would say, although it's true that these things should be talked about at home in families, they're simply not being talked about at all. And you know what? Families, especially Christian families, should take seriously the allegation that we haven't taught our children and teens well enough when it comes to these issues. And are we being silent when we should be educating correctly? Second, in recent years, we've also seen changes in the legal system. A couple years ago, there was a teenage boy who identified as transgender and wanted to undergo hormone therapy. His parents disagreed with his decision and would not allow him to undergo hormone therapy. However, his grandparents agreed with and supported him and told him that if they had custody, they would allow him to undergo such therapy. This thing eventually went down the rabbit hole until eventually it ended up in the court system, where a judge decided that the custody for this teenage boy should be removed from the parents and given to the supporting grandparents, which I think all of us would undoubtedly agree is a tragedy. And third, you might say to yourself, well, my child, my teen is not in the public school system, and neither do they have grandparents that would support such a decision. Well, I just want to make you aware that there are television shows and movies that seem innocent and fun that are also pushing sex education agendas. For example, there's an entire network called the CW that's really geared towards teenage entertainment, and there are shows such as The Flash, such as Supergirl, such as Arrow, and all three of these innocent-looking comic book shows push sexual identity agendas. And so all of us arrive at a place where we must agree that we live in a culture that is permeated with sexual education. And the allegation has been made towards families that they are not educating as they should when it comes to these issues. And so my goal for today is simply to point those things out that are going on in our culture today and to encourage you to have those meaningful conversations with your children and your teens. The world is seeking to educate our children and teens even from a young age, as young as kindergarten. As you saw on the thumbnail, they're pushing books such as My Two Dads, My Two Moms, Heather Has Two Mommies, and My Uncle's Wedding. And they're pushing these ideas as young as 5 years old. And maybe it is unwise to have the talk with your 5-year-old. And I agree with that. It would be unwise to have the talk with your 5-year-old. But from a very young age, you can teach what God's plan for marriage is and how God instituted it in the Garden of Eden and how it's part of God's plan to communicate God's gospel to mankind. And my second goal is to encourage you in a culture in which we are often discouraged. Sometimes we might be tempted to think that if the political climate were just a little bit better, then our lives would be a little bit better off. But as we take a look in the Old Testament and the experiences of Israel, that is simply not the case. When God delivered the Israelites from Egypt in the Exodus, God promised that they would eventually be in a land that God promised for them and that they would have freedom. God does indeed deliver them from Egypt, but because of their rebellion, they are forced to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. They then spend a time in hard conquest in the land after those 40 years. They then spend a time under the judges. They then spend a time under the prophets. And they eventually arrive at the time in their history where they're underneath the authority of kings. And throughout all these eras of Israel's history, the same pattern is repeated over and over again. And the pattern is that they are called to obedience and submission to God, and yet they repeatedly turn to idols that cannot deliver. And so they fall under persecution until King David has a son named Solomon. And Solomon builds the temple, and when Solomon gives his speech to dedicate the temple, he refers twice back to the Exodus and the fact that God today has fulfilled his promise. You are in the land with a king, and God has a permanent house to live among you. And if we were reading the story for the first time, we might be tempted to think, this is it, they've arrived. But sadly, Solomon leads them right back into idolatry. And the pattern is repeated throughout the rest of the Old Testament, that they turn to gods that cannot deliver, and so they fall underneath oppression. And then Jesus comes. And the sad part of history when Jesus comes is that the Israelites are still looking for a political liberator. But political liberators have always proven themselves to be insufficient. It is neither the strength of Samson nor the wisdom of Solomon that can deliver them from their greatest need, which is to be free from sin. But Jesus comes and he does just that. He frees men not from the political oppressors, but from the real and deeper problem, the problem of sin. And even though we live in a society that is becoming more and more corrupt, it is the gospel of Jesus Christ that delivers from sin, and it's in that we place our hope. And once again, thank you for joining us on 5 Minutes for the Family, and we hope to see you next week.